Hello everyone, welcome to the course Disability Studies in India, Historical, Social and Cultural Perspectives. In this module, I am going to talk on Indian literature and disability. So we have discussed policies, we have discussed theorization of disability, we have discussed terms, we have discussed laws, we have also discussed all the models that are associated with people with disabilities, right? So we also discussed gender and disabilities. In the previous module, I was talking about Indian feminism and disability, and I was also discussing that how women with disabilities were not included in the agenda of Indian feminism. So we have already covered this all. So today's lecture is going to be on Indian literature and disability. So when I'm saying lecture, which means that it's not that I'm going to talk about, it is just a module. Today's lecture is going to be on disability in literature, right? Before I go on slides, let me explain to you certain important context in which we read, we study, and we think about disability. First question for me is, how do we think, why do we need to talk about disability in literature? That's my first and primary question. Okay, why do we need to talk about disability in literature? Because the answer would be, literature is something with which we are surrounded. Obviously, when I'm saying literature, I'm limiting myself with books, printed books, not the literature as different meaning it has. For example, everything is literature. Visual text is also literature, provided we provide that context to read visual text as literature. Literature as literature, right? And then other forms of literature. But today, in this module, I'm going to talk only about literature which is related to writers who have written the books, right? The books written by the writers. So I just made this clear, why we need to understand what I'm going to talk about. Okay, so coming back to that, when we, let's say for example, newspaper is also literature, songs are also literatures, right? So I'm not going to talk about songs, newspapers and all, I'm just going to talk about the writings produced by writers. Okay, that's clear. So when I'm saying about literature, let me ask you, how do we think about literature? That's the first and foremost question that we have. How do we think about literature? What is literature? Because until and unless we understand this, I think we won't be able to understand that why we are talking about disability in literature. So I have noticed that many of my students say that literature mirror the reality, right? Reflect the reality. I have a very problem, I have a very dislike, I am not happy with this idea that literature mirror the society. It's very important to understand, because once we know what it does, what literature does to the society, what is the relationship between literature and society, what is the connection that they have, literature and society, then only we can think about the discourse of disability in literature. So if suppose someone says that literature mirror the society, right? Literature reflect the society or reflect the reality. If that is the case, let me ask you give you some examples and then you can think about it. What about literature written by Shakespeare? Does it reflect the reality? Because Shakespeare is talking about very few specific characters. And we all know that individuals are not the same. Right? Everyone is different, every community is different, every culture is different. Why is it so then we are talking about Shakespeare in India as well, thinking that it also reflects our reality? Then people will say they are talking about inner characteristics that everyone has. For example, jealousy, revenge. This is what literature talks about. But then again, I would say that these are the features which are imposed on the people. In India, we have noticed that people are not full of vengeance. They don't believe in the revenge, or they are not jealous, right? If you look at our historical text, if you look at the way people have practiced, I can give you n number of examples. People are not what Shakespeare is talking about, right? So, how far it is relevant to say that literature reflects the reality? Because for me, it does not. I mean, the newspaper reflect much deeper than literature, because it tells you the entire news, it records the events, it presents before us, right? This definition of literature has to be cleared first. Then only we can understand why I be talking about disability in literature. So this, if you look at any text, if you look at any literature, I'm not saying it has nothing to do with the reality, but I have a problem with this idea that it reflects the reality. It does not reflect the reality. It just talks about certain things which author feels, right? Author has written the book, and then author what he feels and perceives. He has written and he has chosen the language. Obviously, in post-structuralism, author is dead, and then we have a text which speaks. But if you are coming to this level, like thinking about at the post-structuralist level, then you also know that language constructs the reality, it does not reflect the reality, right? So, in both ways, either if you believe that like work is a mind work, right? The work text is produced by the mind of an author. If that is the case, then if an author is not able to see certain things, if author is not interested in talking about something things, because everyone has a limitations, right? Like author is like a camera. Whatever he wants to see, he just see and tell us. And maybe as camera colors, camera project in a different way, in the same way author also does, because he has also subjective perception. What he feels, what he thinks, what he wants to write. So, there are enough work written which talks about how author can be also questioned. He does not. How can a person be neutral? A person can never be neutral, right? I'm sure that we have talked about the subject and subjectivity. Writer is also produced by an author. Writer is also produced by society, by culture, by text. Then he also has a limitations. His subjectivity is governed by the economic condition that he believes in. So it is not possible for him to reflect the reality. He is just possible to tell something what he feels is right or wrong. So far we have come to this conclusion and we have understood. I can go on and speak about that how literature does not reflect the reality. But then it will take a lot of time, but at least by giving some few examples and few understanding that I told you, we made this clear that it does not reflect the reality. What else we can see, right? Because if you see the famous example I gave when we are talking about London, right? When we are talking about London, William Blake talks about London differently. William Wordsworth is talking about London differently, right? Everyone is going to say something about London differently. William Blake, Wordsworth, they both are romantic poets. They both are romantic poets and they both are talking about London but in a different way. Why is it so? Think about it. If literature reflects the reality, then why is it so that two people are talking about London differently? They should talk the same way. And we read, we analyze. Alright? In fact, Ben Jonson in his play, The Alchemist, has also talked about London and very different picture that he puts forward than any other writers of that Jacobean and Elizabethan age. So, what then, if that, like now, what does literature then do? Literature constitutes the reality. It gives us the perception to see the reality. One, literature is not an innocent act. Second, literature has method to talk about reality in a different way. So, literature uses, it represents the character and either positively or negatively the way it wants. Our job is to question the presumptions through which it has been produced. Our job is to look at the assumptions on which it is writing. Let's say, for example, this. Let me give an example. Let's look at the very famous text called Macbeth. Right? Macbeth is written by Shakespeare, and you see there is a character called Lady Macbeth. I have seen my students past 10 years, I have noticed, and every time I go into the class, I challenge that. They think that Lady Macbeth, I am sure that you all know that, Lady Macbeth is responsible for the downfall of Macbeth. But that's not true. If you read the play, there are many examples. There are many events that explicitly tells us that Lady Macbeth is not responsible. She has been used so that blame can be shifted on her, and that is how narrative also progresses. You see, text makes you believe that it is because of Lady Macbeth, there is a fall of Macbeth, because Macbeth is going to be projected as a hero. That's a job, that's a narrative. Narrative is already set. Our job is to question and counter that narrative. We all have shifted our focus. Imagine that the play is written to be performed. Play is not written to be watched, it's written to be performed. So when it is written to be performed, imagine that how it's happening. So in this way, we see that there is stereotypes about women, stereotypes about disability, stereotypes about nationality. If you read The Merchant of Venice, you will see that nationalities has been stereotyped. These stereotype prejudices can be also noticed in the character, in the text. You can easily identify. And the problem is, this is perpetuated. This is perpetuated by the literature. And what we do in our everyday lives, we encounter with that reality. We encounter with that reality. And due to that encounter, this belief, this stereotype is also ingrained in us. You are getting my point. So that stereotype is also ingrained in us. And then We have that perceptions to see people with disability, women, people from other nationalities in that way. That is a problem that I'm talking about. That is the question that I'm raising. How shall we produce the counter narrative to that? We will produce counter narrative by believing that literature does not reflect the reality, but it has chosen as a method to produce stereotypes about nationalities and other things. If we consider literature as a holy book, we won't be able to question that. We won't, like I have seen many researchers, they do not question what author is writing about. They just say author believes it, author says this, author does this. And if we say this, then we won't be able to produce the counter narrative, and our job is to produce the counter narrative. Alright. So, which is why we are talking about disability in literature, just to see, just to notice what literature has to say about disability. Since our course is on disability studies in India, historical, social and cultural perspectives, because literature is also product of a culture. Literature is also a product of a culture. So, we need to see, because it is a reflection. We can see that. So, therefore, we need to see how disability is represented. What is the purpose and objective is being served by disability? How author is using disability? What they have to say about disability? In whether positive or negative or whatever, I'm not concerned about that. I'm just concerned about how do they project, how do they talk about it. So the first lecture is on literature, disability in literature, generally, how it is. And then I will proceed further and talk about how disability has been spoken in Indian literature as well. Alright. So, that is a point, that is a concern that I have. So, that is why the first lecture is going to be this. Let's look at the first slide. So, in the first slide, I am talking about disability in literature offers a window, right? It offers a window into the experience, challenges and unique perspectives of those who navigate life with disabilities. From ancient text to contemporary works, representation of disability reflect societal attitudes. That's the point that we need to keep in the mind, right? Disability in literature, like read this very carefully, because this is the beginning of our discussion that we are going to talk about on discourse, how it is projected. So, it offers a window, right? That's the point I'm saying. It offers a window into the experience, challenges and unique perspective of those who navigate life with disability. From ancient text to contemporary works, representation of, here you see, from ancient text to contemporary works, representation of disability reflect societal attitudes, cultural values, evolving understanding of bodily difference and mental diversity. So, the portrayal of disability has not always been positive or accurate. You see, that's the point, which is shaped by, I was talking about it, stereotype biases, limited understanding. So, we must explore the depiction of disability in literature, examining how it has evolved, how writers today are reshaping this narrative. That's our job. That's why I'm talking about disability in literature. To challenge stigmas and broaden inclusivity. So, historically, disability in literature often took on symbolic roles. In ancient and classical text, characters with disabilities frequently represented moral or spiritual failing, supernatural punishment, or societal curses. So we have a Greek tragedies that uses blindness to symbolize wisdom for inner sight, as seen in character like Tiresias. Characters who are physically different or deformed often symbolized internal corruption or moral decay in Shakespearean and medieval literature. Right? So, in these two slides, what I'm doing, I just told you the first slide that why are we using literature? Because it offers obviously unique experience, unique perspective as well about the life, about the society, about the character, about the moralities. But we're not supposed to think that it is talking about the society in a very, true way. That's a question that I'm asking you not to do this. Like, you are not supposed to believe this. So, what is then our job today? Our job is to see how literature is also evolving. How literature is also evolving, how it is changing itself. Because what we will notice, that the way literature was written in 16th century is not the same in 17th, not in 18th, not in the 20th or today. Because of certain reasons which are responsible, let's say for example, if you read Elizabethan literature, the women, the way they are represented or the way they have been discussed, it's not being discussed in today's time. Because things have changed, society has changed. But our job is to see that how it has progressed, what made this progression happen. I'm not talking about negative or positive. I'm talking about what made this progress happen. In what ways, how, in what direction. What are the factors are responsible to make this happen. Right? So, our critical scrutiny would be to see how literatures are reshaped. Right? Keeping this in the mind, how it has reshaped. For example, in the Greek literature, we see Tiresias. Tiresias is an important mythical character who are often used by Western literature. And he is blind, he doesn't have eyes. But he has always been projected as if he can see the future. Right? This character symbolizes wisdom and inner sight. What he says, like in fact, he's starting from the Oedipus Rex, right, where he is making the prophecy, So, these kind of characters are used for what purpose? Obviously, what we see, different from the human. They are not very much part of the society. They are something different. We'll talk about this in detail. Alright, let's go to the next slide. So, in the next slide when we see, right, these representation, while powerful, did little to explore the actual lived experiences of disability. Instead, used it as a normative tool. So, disabled characters were often denied full personhood or complexity, reducing them to symbols of misfortune, sin, or even wisdom in ways that overlooked individual agencies or societal realities of living with disability. Like here, I'm talking it here. So, this was on the symbolic rather than understanding disability as a face of human diversity. That's a problem that we identified here, that these characters were denied full personhood or complexities. They were reduced as a symbols of misfortune or sin, right? So, with the rise of realism in the 19th century, literature began to explore disability as a real lived experience rather than merely a metaphor. You understand? That's a shift that we notice. In the 19th century, what we are visualizing is that disability has a real and lived experience. Dickens introduced characters like Tiny Tim in A Christmas Carol, presenting a disabled character who, while somewhat idealized, evokes empathy, challenges readers to confront the struggle of people with disabilities. So, even in this more compassionate approach, characters like Tiny Tim often existed to evoke pity or moral rather than as a fully developed individual with their own desires and complexity. And then when we come to the 20th century, author begins to delve deeper into the complexities of disability. Let's say we have Faulkner, The Sound and the Fury in italics, portrays the character of Benji Compson, a man with intellectual disability. Faulkner's stream of consciousness techniques allows reader to glimpse the world through Benji's perspective, fostering empathy and understanding of his unique sensory experiences. We have Ken Kesey. This is a very famous novel. I would suggest to you that if you are interested in disability, if you are interested in exploring mental disability and how does institutions works on disability and oppresses disability, please read this novel for sure. And if you cannot read this, at least you can watch this movie. It critically examines mental disability and institutionalization, challenging stereotypes, right? It challenges stereotypes and also the harsh treatment imposed on those who are neurologically different. So, two things that we notice when we are moving from 16, 17, 18, 19, that before it is very rare to see that authors are exploring the lived experiences of people with disabilities. They are just there to serve the purpose, nothing else. Then as we proceed further, still we see that there is an attempt, but still the old prejudices are still dominant in literature, and it only projects people with disability as if they are burden on the society, right? And once we come to 19th century, obviously we see the hospitals, we see mental asylums, we see prisons, we see many setups which are there, and we see the reality what they do, how oppressive they are when it comes to body marked with differences, how it engages with, how it deals with, how it treats mental disabled people, right? So, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest is my favorite text. I would suggest you that you please read to see that, all right. So, the situation, the projection that we see is still very bleak in projection of literature and by authors in the societies. That is why in the beginning of my slide I was asking you that it is high time that we should reshape our literature, we should question our literature. The way it engages with disability, we have to figure this out and critically analyze. So, to conclude my lecture, I would say that if you want to do research, literature is obviously a wonderful area where you can explore the way people with disabilities are projected, represented, and moving beyond how they are constitutes and redefined in literature. There are many more possibilities which I will be talking in upcoming lectures as well. So, thank you so much for your patient listening to me. Thank you so much once again for your attention, paying attention. All right. Thank you once again. Take care. Bye bye. See you next time.